Okay, so we are getting close to the end of this particular book on sustainability principles, and here we are in chapter 9, part 3, about changing the world. It's about developing capacities for resilience. You probably noticed the background is different now from the previous podcast because I have been forced to move to a new place. It's bigger, but I lost the gorgeous lake view, and I have now a green view which is full of mango trees, and the mango season is coming. A lot of flowers and little raw mangoes are in the trees, so it's not too bad. Nonetheless, let's continue with this. So what are we doing here? Our world is in a precarious state. We witness increasing discrepancies between our preferred and actual development trajectories, resulting from local calamity and global tribulations, and all but very few scientists anticipate more trouble in the future. So this is talking about the IPCC assessment reports, which do the future projections about extreme events, sea level rise, glacier loss, crop losses, impacts on health, and so on. As we have probably mentioned already, or you can look up my podcast on IPCC projections under climate science, and not everybody agrees about this idea of projecting to 2100 because there are a lot of assumptions made and a lot of uncertainties in the projections. Sometimes they feel too alarmist, especially because we're not dealing very well with what's happening right now. But we still have to face this sustainability challenge and build resilience, so there is no escaping that. The increasingly great developmental leaps we have taken since the outset of the Industrial Revolution have not only resulted in increased economic purchasing power, life expectancy, adult literacy, etc., but also in a range of sustainability challenges introduced in the first part of this book. Most influential voices of the international community cry out the need for addressing issues of risk and unsustainable development, and many of them frame a way forward in terms of capacity development or building. So UNCSD, Sustainable UN Center for Sustainable Development, there is Sustainable Development Network, and so on. They are slightly different than IPCC. IPCC does provide mitigation pathways. Adaptation was not a big part of the agenda because in fact they wanted to avoid adaptation when they started in the 1990s. Now it's become a big part of it. Vulnerability, impacts and assessment is part of the reporting. So we have to be careful about what kind of information actually is provided by the IPCC and whether that's really useful for adaptation. So I have many articles on this, and I have podcasts on this that you can look up. Coming back here, in other words, while a community, organization, society, or other human environmental system must develop its own capacities to be resilient, external actors can play important roles in supporting such development, which is what we have been discussing. So I'm just jumping around again. Although the concept of capacity building did not come into a wider use until the 1990s, and capacity development roughly a decade later in 2000s, similar ideas have been around since more or less the start of the organized international development cooperation in the 1950s. The focus of these conceptual predecessors, such as institution building or institutional development, was also on developing capacities to meet various development objectives on different levels. The global inequities, faster growth and development in the West, industrialized Western educated nations versus the global South, have always been an issue, and in various fora they have always come up. They provided comprehensive guidelines for how external actors could facilitate such developments, but were in practice too often equated with technical assistance or cooperation, in which external actors regularly assumed prominent roles as drivers of change. This played out in many ways, not only in terms of assistance through development banks, but also transferring Western ideas on how to install energy capacities and so on based on the Western ways of doing things without necessarily having a long-term vision on whether that's the best for the global south or not, and so on. This in turn frequently led to activities that were basically designed and implemented by external actors and not generating much sustainable results. So they were not location specific, they were not very region specific or thought of in terms of what's best for the location. Blueprints don't exist for such things, but we have a tendency to try to replicate what worked in one place and hope that it also works in other places. So as theory underwrote the ideas behind the early concepts of capacity development, while practice failed, the solution was the reinvention of them under the name of capacity building. Then, after another decade of insufficient results, the ideas were again reinvented under the concept of capacity development. So went from capacity development to capacity building and back to capacity development. There are obviously conceptual differences between these concepts since scientists, policymakers and practitioners learned continuously over the decades, but not to the extent indicated by the proponents of the new concepts. It's clear that most of the arguments for the new concepts are made by describing the predecessors in terms of how it was applied in practice, while presenting the new concept in terms of how it is described in theory. Okay, so it's one thing to have the theory and it's another thing to see how it actually works in practice. For instance, capacity building is now described as having a narrow scope, focusing on building capacities from scratch, being mainly concerned with external actors' activities and having short-term focus, while capacity development is described as having broader scope, focusing on developing existing capacities rather than starting from scratch, being mainly concerned with creating local ownership and having long-term focus. So as opposed to bringing in blueprints from elsewhere and implementing them with the short-term plans, you look at what is locally relevant and what is locally developed with ownership and have a long-term focus. This is not at all a fair comparison, but more of putting words into the mouth of our forerunners to make us appear as having progressed more than we actually have. So that's quite an indictment, and it's generally true. Capacity building is neither having a narrow scope at all if reading Deborah Ead's influential work, nor is it focusing on building capacities from scratch. So interpretations differ. Even White's 1968 early writings on institutional development highlight the importance of local ownership, and Gann's definition of institution building clearly describes long-term focus. So we will talk a bit more about this, or by the time you get to this, maybe you would have already gone through Elinor Ostrom's work as presented in the book called Sustaining the Commons, where we discuss a lot about institution building and sustaining the commons by engaging the actors in a particular action situation with local ownership. So it's true that we have learned a lot over the years, but it's simply not a good idea to disregard the roots of much contemporary knowledge. So it sounds a bit abstract here in the way it's presented, in the way I'm reading, but go and read the book and the papers that are cited here to understand what we mean. So this chapter basically presents key ideas concerning capacity development for resilience, focusing on its potential for changing the world in terms of making it safer and more sustainable, keeping in mind that here resilience is meant to say there are detours in terms of risk as we go along towards sustainable development, and resilience means we can keep coming back to the pathway to sustainable development. So it starts out by elaborating on different levels of capacity that must be addressed holistically to explain, understand and improve resilience, linking back to the operationalization of the concept of resilience as we defined in chapter 6, which we can go back and listen to again. Then I present what capacity development for resilience entails, focusing on defining, designing and deconditioning it to provide a foundation for more effective capacity development in the future. The chapter ends with a presentation of a framework with 14 aspects concerning roles, responsibilities, relationships, and skill sets to keep in mind and focus on for capacity development initiatives to be successful in practice. So let's leave this here and come back and look at 4 levels of capacity. Okay, so capacity development, capacity building, long-term vision, short-term vision, scopes, broad or narrow, and so on, are all important ideas, but we'll just look at here in terms of what is generally implemented. We don't do too many case studies in this case, but the references given do consider the implementations and how they have evolved over time. So you should definitely follow up on the citations if you are interested in further details. I'm just sticking relatively closely to the book, since the book is following Sustaining the Commons, where there are some case studies provided for water and food and so on and so forth. Okay, there are also other examples in net zero implementation on campuses, sustainability practices on campuses, and I have a couple of sections on sustainability research in social science and science, and then we'll look at sustainability education as well. So there is a broader context in which these podcasts can be placed if you follow up all the sections, but that's a lot. In general, when you teach a course in class, as I've always said in adaptation as well, you would condense all these into something that fits within a semester, or you will make a 2-semester course and not have so many sections presented together. But on YouTube, you get to pick and choose and do your own self-directed learning, so I just tend to put everything together and let you choose how you want to focus this for yourself. Okay, so let's come back and meet on in the next podcast on capacity building.